The chest arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, carried by two men who did not know what it contained and did not ask. It was not a large chest. It was perhaps 2 feet wide, bound in cracked leather gone dark with age, fitted with a brass lock of the older style, the kind that had not been fashionable for 40 years. The men set it on the counter, collected their coin from Mr. Tidewell, and were gone before the bell above the door had finished ringing. Eliza stood behind the counter with the shop ledger open before her and looked at the lock for a long moment. She had been managing Mr. Tidewell's books for 2 years, long enough to know that uncatalogued items arriving without a key were either treasure or trouble, and that the difference was rarely apparent until it was too late. She reached out and tried the lock once with her finger, found it firm, and wrote in the ledger the only accurate entry she could make. 1 chest, leather-bound, brass lock, contents unknown. The rain had been falling since dawn, and the shop smelled of wet wool and lamp oil. It was the 3rd week of November, and the street outside the window was gray and still. No one came for the first hour, except a woman returning a garnet brooch she had borrowed against last month, and a boy with a parcel of silver that turned out to be silver-plated brass. Eliza recorded both with the same steady hand, told the boy the truth about the silver, and did not look at the chest again until the bell rang a second time and the Viscount of Ashley stepped through the door. She knew who he was. One learned, in this trade, to read the quality of a man's coat before his face, and his coat was the sort that required no second glance. Dark wool, perfectly fitted at the shoulder, not a thread misplaced despite the rain on his sleeve. He was tall, and still in the way of men who had learned to take up only as much room as they required, and he stood for a moment inside the door, with rain on his collar, and his eyes went directly to the chest. Not to her, to the chest, as if he had known it would be there. "Good morning," she said. He looked at her then. His eyes were gray, the color of the November sky outside, and he did not speak at once. "I am told," he said after a pause that was precisely 1 beat too long to be comfortable, "that a chest was brought here this morning." Eliza set down her pen. "We receive a great many items," she said. He looked at the chest again. Something moved in his face, very briefly, that she could not name. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. The expression of a man arriving somewhere he had been looking for long enough that finding it had become difficult to believe. "Is Mr. Tidewell available?" he said. "He is resting," she said. "I manage the shop in the mornings. If you have business, you may conduct it with me." He turned his gaze back to her face and held it there, level and unreadable. "Very well," he said. He moved toward the counter, stopped 2 feet from the chest, and said nothing further for a moment. Then he said it simply, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. "Do not sell it." She blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The chest." His voice was measured, the words flat and certain. "Whatever is offered for it. Do not sell it until I return." It was not a request. She understood that. She also understood that she was not in the habit of receiving commands from strangers about items in Mr. Tidewell's inventory, and she told him so, politely, but precisely. He met her eyes. He said, "I will offer a fair price. More than fair. I need time to arrange it. 2 days. He paused. "Please." The word sat in the space between them as if it had cost him something to produce it. She thought of the ledger entry she had written. Contents unknown. She thought of the lock she could not open. 2 days, she said. "I cannot promise more than that." He nodded once and was gone before she had finished speaking. And the bell rang, and the shop was quiet again. And and the chest sat on the counter with its brass lock turned toward her, and she did not know yet what it held, only that something about it had made a composed man's face go still and old for one unguarded moment. She went back to the ledger. She did not sell it. The life of a pawnbroker's assistant in the third week of November was not a life many of Eliza's acquaintance would have chosen, and several had said so with varying degrees of tactfulness over the past 2 years. She had been educated well enough at one of the small private schools that accepted the daughters of men with claims to better things, and her father had possessed a claim of his own. His grandparents were said to have been lawfully married, their union recorded in the coronation year of the old king, and the Harwood estate in Wiltshire should by rights have come to him on the death of the previous holder. It had not. The documents, they were told, could not be located. The claim was found without foundation. Her father had died 3 years ago, with the matter still unresolved, and Eliza had been left with his books, his neat handwriting, a head for figures, and the knowledge that the world found these assets insufficient. Mr. Tidwell had not. He was 74, and suffered from a difficulty with his hands that made small work slow, and he had needed someone precise and honest who did not regard a pawnbroker's shop as beneath her. Eliza did not. She had a room above the shop, plain and clean, with one window that looked out over a lane behind the building where pigeons gathered in the morning. She had her salary, her father's books on the small shelf above the washstand, and the discipline of a daily routine that kept her from spending too much time with questions she could not answer. The shop itself suited her in ways she had not anticipated. It was a place of interrupted stories. Every item that came through the door had been somewhere else first, had been used or valued or neglected by someone whose circumstances had changed enough to bring it here. She found herself, in quiet moments between customers, speculating about origins. The garnet brooch that came back every month, the set of silver fish knives that had clearly been a wedding gift from someone who had never eaten fish, the miniature portrait of an elderly naval officer that no one had ever come to reclaim. The chest did not feel like those things. The chest felt deliberate. She was turning this thought over on the second afternoon, in the quiet hour before closing, when he returned. He came in precisely on time, which she had not quite expected. And this time, he removed his hat at the door and held it in his hands, which was not a gesture she would have predicted from him. He asked, before anything else, how Mr. Tidwell was keeping. He asked it with a specific quality of attention. Not courteous filler, but an actual question, and she answered it honestly, because the question had apparently earned honesty. His name, she had found by asking discreetly of their regulars, was Edmund Vane, Viscount Ashley. He held the title from his father, who had died 4 years ago. He was said to be precise in his affairs, and close with his private concerns. A man who spoke little, and did not change his mind without reason. 2 of Mr. Tidwell's regular customers had referred to him respectfully and with some caution, the way one refers to a fixed point on a map. He purchased the chest that morning for twice what it had been brought in for. He did not have a key. He held the chest under one arm and paid with precise coin, and turned to go, and Eliza said, "You do not ask what is in it." He stopped. He did not turn around immediately. Then he turned. "I know what is in it," he said. The room went very quiet. "Then perhaps," she said, "you might tell me." He looked at her with those gray eyes, and she had the distinct and strange sensation of being seen quite carefully by someone who had been half expecting her. "Not today," he said. "I will." He left with the chest, and she stood at the counter for a long time after the bell had stopped ringing, holding the thought of that phrase in her mind. Not today. The certainty of it. The implication of a later. She had no reason to trust that a viscount would return to a pawnbroker's shop with anything she wanted to hear. She trusted it anyway, which was not like her. and the fact that it was not like her was itself a piece of information she filed away without examining too closely. It was 2 weeks after the chest had left the shop that the Duchess came in. Eliza knew the Duchess by sight the way one knows a monument. She was too large in the room for her actual physical dimensions, a woman of perhaps 60, with hair gone silver, and a bearing that organized the space around her. She was not the sort of woman who entered pawnbrokers' shops. She entered this one with a companion and looked around with a measured survey that catalogued everything and found it wanting. And then she approached the counter. "I am given to understand," she said, "that a chest was brought here some weeks ago. Leather-bound, an older style of lock." "Items come and go," Eliza said. "I cannot always speak to specifics." The Duchess studied her with the attentive disinterest of a woman examining furniture. Her companion, a woman in fashionable gray, stood at a slight remove. "I am told my nephew has been conducting business in this establishment," the Duchess said. She said the word establishment in a way that was technically accurate, and yet not a compliment. "I should like to know the nature of it." "I am not at liberty to speak to any patron's business," Eliza said. She kept her voice level. She kept her hand still on the counter. She had learned in this shop that the way to manage the unreasonable was to be uninteresting. The Duchess made a small sound and looked at her companion. "The pawnbroker's girl," she said quietly to the woman beside her. "Edmund has apparently been spending his time very unusually." They left. The bell rang. Eliza stood still for a moment and then returned to the ledger. And the entry she wrote was brief and careful. And she did not let herself consider the slight tremor in her wrist as she wrote it. She was her father's daughter. She had been called worse. It was 3 days after the Duchess's visit that Edmund came back to the shop, not to purchase anything, but on what appeared to be an errand Mr. Tidewell had asked of him, a small matter of an appraisal involving a collection of old maps that required a particular expertise. He was in the back room with the elderly man for perhaps half an hour while Eliza managed the counter, and she did not think of him particularly except as a presence in the next room, a quality of stillness that she had come to associate with his approach. In the same way one notes the particular sound of a specific carriage on the cobbles outside. She heard their voices through the wall, Mr. Tidewell's thin and quick, Edmund's lower and measured. Then, for a stretch, the voices went quiet. A man came in at 11:30. He was not one of their regulars. He was broad and loud and aggrieved about a debt, and the debt was not owed by Mr. Tidewell, but by someone associated with this address, and the man was not careful about the distinction. He set both hands on the counter and leaned in, and his voice was not a pleasant thing in the small shop, and Eliza met his eyes and did not step back. She said it precisely, as she would have read a column of figures to a doubtful client. The sum he was owed was not this shop's liability. If he had a legitimate claim, he might bring it to the magistrate's office on Bow Street, where it would be assessed and returned to him within a fortnight, with whatever portion of it could be recovered through proper channels. She wrote out the address for him from memory while she spoke, in a hand that was steady and clear, and told him that shouting at ledgers would not recover a penny, and asked him pleasantly to lower his voice or leave. There was a silence. The man left with the paper in his hand. She went back to the ledger. She heard, a few minutes later, the door to the back room open. She did not look up until she had finished the entry she was writing. Edmund was standing near the counter. He did not say anything for a moment. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not approval, precisely. Something more considered than approval. The expression of a man who has been adding up a series of small observations and has arrived at a sum that confirms something he had suspected, but had not yet permitted himself to state plainly. He said, "You wrote that address from memory." "We have occasion to send people there regularly," she said. Another silence. She looked up then and found him still watching her. She looked at him steadily. If you find yourself wanting to know what he was going to say next, I understand it. Stay close. He said, "I should like to speak to you about the chest, if you can spare an hour." "Mr. Tidewell does not need me until 3, she said. They walked to a small tea room nearby that was respectable and quiet, and Edmund sat across from her with his hat on the table and looked at the tablecloth for a moment after the tea had been brought. Then he said, "The chest contains documents, a record of a marriage." Eliza held very still. "Your grandparents," he said. "Thomas Harwood and Anne Harwood, formerly Weston. They were married in 1761, in the coronation year of King George III. The marriage was recorded in the official register of that year, a copy of which was produced by the officiating vicar and held in a chest of private family papers. The tea was warm in her hands. She noticed she was holding the cup very carefully. "My father's claim," she said. "Was not baseless," Edmund said. His voice was level and quiet. "He was the legitimate son of a lawful marriage. The Harwood estate should have come to him. The documents that would have proven this were removed from their original location approximately 14 years ago. 14 years. She had been 9 years old. Removed by whom?" she said. He did not look away. "My aunt, the Duchess of Merton." A long silence sat between them. A woman at the next table poured her tea. The fire in the corner of the tea room shifted and settled. She set the cup down. She said, "And you have known this?" "I have suspected it for 3 years," he said. "I have known it with certainty for somewhat longer. What I did not know was where the documents were." He reached into his coat and drew out something she had not expected. A small brass key on a plain ring, worn smooth with handling. The patina of something carried for a very long time in a coat pocket, against the body's warmth. He set it on the table between them. "I have had that key for 14 years, he said. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said carefully, as if choosing each word for its weight alone, "I was 19. My aunt told me the chest was being moved for safekeeping. A woman came to the door of my father's house the same evening and asked me to intervene." He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. A controlled gesture, the kind that marks a man holding something that he does not intend to set down. She was quite young. She said the chest belonged to her husband's family, and that it was being taken wrongfully, and she asked me to stop it. Eliza knew, before he said the next words, what he was going to say. She could hear it in the texture of the preceding sentence, in the specific quality of the pause that followed it. "I did not," he said. "I believed my aunt." The woman was turned away. A year later, Eliza's mother had died in childbed. Eliza had been born into what remained. She did not speak for a long time. She looked at the key on the table between them, worn to a shine at the bow where it had been held and held and held. Outside the tea-room window, the November street moved past, and the sky was white and low, and somewhere above the rooftops the clouds were gathering for rain that would not come until evening. He did not ask for anything. He did not reach across the table. He sat with his hands flat on the cloth and looked at the key and waited, and she understood that he had been waiting for a long time in one form or another, and that the waiting was not over, and that he knew it. "You have been looking for it," she said at last. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He looked at the key. "Because it was mine to correct," he said. There was no self-pity in the words and no plea for absolution. Just a statement of arithmetic." She looked at him for a long time across the small table. The wound in his face was not a visible thing, not in the usual sense. It was the kind that showed only in the precision of a man's stillness, in the careful flatness of the words he chose, in the key he had kept for 14 years, and the way he set it on the table without looking away when he said what he was saying. She did not absolve him. She did not condemn him. She said, "What do you intend to do?" "Open it," he said, "properly, with a solicitor present." She nodded once. She picked up her tea. He did not pick up the key. He said, "That key belongs to you." She left it on the table. She said, "Give it to me when the chest is open." She did not see him for 11 days after that. What she did not know, in those 11 days, was that the Duchess had learned from her companion what the chest might contain, and had moved with the efficiency of a woman who had managed difficult situations for 60 years. She called on her solicitor, a Mr. Farrant who had handled her affairs for 2 decades, and was not overly strict about the boundary between legal and advantageous. She produced a claim that the chest held private correspondence belonging to her late husband's estate, correspondence that was her legal property by the terms of his will, and she obtained an injunction requiring its surrender before any contents could be examined. The injunction was filed on a Thursday. Eliza did not know about it. She knew only that Edmund did not come, and that the Duchess's companion, Mrs. Farrow, passed the shop one afternoon and paused outside the window to look in with a particular quality of inspection, and that the mornings felt longer than they had before, and the ledger offered less distraction than she would have liked. 3 days before Edmund finally appeared again, Eliza attended a small gathering at the home of a mutual acquaintance, at Mr. Tidwell's insistence, because he was concerned she did not go out enough, and had said so with the gentle persistence of a man who did not have enough occasions to say it. She sat near the fire in a cream gown that was 3 seasons old but well kept, and she drank tea and spoke to 2 women who were pleasant if not particularly engaging, and she was entirely composed until Lady Sophronia Price entered the room. Lady Sophronia was a widow of 32, dressed in pale blue that cost more than Eliza's monthly salary, and she was immediately the most polished object in a room that contained several polished objects. She did not address Eliza. She moved through the room with the ease of a woman for whom rooms reorganized themselves, and she fell into conversation with a cluster of women near the window, and her voice carried the way voices do when the carrying is not entirely accidental. She said that the Duchess had mentioned that Lord Ashley had been seen quite regularly at a pawnbroker's establishment near Cheapside. She said that the Duchess found it characteristic of Edmund to take a personal interest in unusual cases. She said, with a small, precise smile that did not quite reach her eyes, that the pawnbroker's girl apparently had a talent for managing difficult clients, and that the Duchess considered it rather touching. The 2 women with Lady Sophronia laughed softly. Lady Sophronia moved on. Eliza set her teacup down with a steadiness that cost her something, and crossed the room to the window and looked out at the street below until her breathing was even, and her face was, she was reasonably confident, indistinguishable from her usual expression. She had been called worse. She knew this. The knowing helped less than it should have. 4 days later, Mr. Tidwell's housekeeper came to find her in the shop. Mrs. Penn was a stout, reliable woman who delivered bad news with the careful reluctance of someone who would rather be carrying anything else. She had been at the market, she said, and had encountered a Mrs. Aldgate, who was the sort of woman who knew things and considered it her social responsibility to share them promptly. Mrs. Aldgate had heard, from someone in the Duchess's immediate circle, that Lord Ashley had agreed to the injunction without contest. He had surrendered the chest to the Duchess's solicitor. He was expected, moreover, to announce his engagement to Lady Sophronia before the year was out, which the Duchess had long considered a sensible arrangement, and which, Mrs. Aldgate had implied, was now as good as settled. Mrs. Penn delivered this information with the careful discomfort of a woman who does not wish to be the bearer of it, but considers silence a worse option. Eliza thanked her. She went back to the ledger. She wrote nothing for a long moment, and then she wrote a neat column of figures that needed no writing, because she had already calculated them, and she was aware that her hand was perfectly steady, and she was aware that this steadiness was the kind that comes not from calm, but from a resolved and finished thing, the kind of steady one achieves when one has stopped expecting otherwise. She thought of the key on the table in the tea room. She thought of the phrase it was mine to correct, said without plea or self-pity. And she thought of the 11 days of silence. And she thought of Lady Sophronia's smile. And she assembled these things into the shape that most fit the available evidence. And the shape was familiar. It was the shape of something that was not going to happen, after all. She had been her father's daughter with her father's failed claim, and her mother's early grave, and a room above a pawnbroker's shop. She had been the woman the Duchess surveyed like furniture. She had been, for approximately 11 days, foolish enough to believe that a man with gray eyes and a worn key had meant something specific by setting it on the table between them. She went home that evening and sat in her room above the shop for a long time. She did not cry, because she was not in the habit of crying over things that had simply turned out as they were always likely to have turned out. She was aware, however, of a particular silence in the room that had not been there the previous week, the specific silence of a possibility that has been carefully closed. He came to the shop the following morning. He came in at 9 o'clock, before the shop was properly open, and Eliza was behind the counter with the ledger, and did not immediately look up. She heard the bell and said, without looking, that they did not open until 10. "I am aware," he said. She looked up. He looked precisely as he always looked, composed, upright, gray-eyed, the coat impeccable, the hat in his hands. There was, however, something in the set of his mouth that was not quite his usual composure. It was the expression of a man who had done a considerable amount of work in the past 11 days and wished to be accurate about reporting it, and who understood that accuracy in this particular instance was not a small thing. "I need you to come with me," he said. "I cannot leave the shop," she said. "Mrs. Penn has agreed to sit here until 10. He paused. "I have arranged a carriage." She looked at him steadily. "I was told," she said, "that you surrendered the chest." "You were told," he said, "exactly what I needed my aunt to believe." He stopped. He reached into his coat. He set the brass key on the counter between them, and then he set, beside it, a second object. A document, folded in thirds and sealed with a legal stamp already opened, the seal broken in the manner of something examined and filed, a paper bearing a senior solicitor's mark and a date from 3 weeks prior. "I had Mr. Calloway, who practices before the King's Bench, present when I opened the chest," Edmund said. His voice was quiet and exact. "Before my aunt moved, before the injunction was drawn. Calloway's copy of the marriage register was filed with the official record the same afternoon. The chest that my aunt's solicitor seized was emptied in advance. The injunction applies to a box containing nothing of legal relevance." He paused. "What was inside it is already on record." Eliza looked at the key. She looked at the document beside it. She said, "You might have told me." He said, "I did not want you to carry it, if it failed." She did not speak for a moment. She looked at the key on the counter, worn to a shine at the bow, 14 years of pocket warmth smoothed into the metal. "Come with me," he said again. The Duchess of Merton received them in her principal drawing room, which was a room of considerable height and blue silk walls, and the sort of furniture that had been chosen by someone who wished others to understand the choosing. Lady Sophronia Price was there, seated near the window in pale gray today, with the particular posture of a woman who expects things to be confirmed in her favor. 3 other women of the Duchess's circle were arranged about the room. A footman stood by the door, very still. The Duchess rose when Eliza entered, and for a fraction of a second something moved across her face. A recalculation, a reassessment, quickly smoothed away. She had not expected Eliza. She had perhaps not expected either of them. "Edmund," she said, "this is not what I anticipated." "I know," he said. He was still carrying his hat. He did not sit. He said, "I have come to tell you that Mr. Calloway has filed the Harwood marriage record with the appropriate official register. The record was examined by 2 independent solicitors of good standing. It is unimpeachable. The proceedings for restoration of the Harwood entitlement are formally commenced." Silence. Thorough and held. The Duchess said, "Edmund, the legal proceedings will take some months," he said. "They are already in motion." He looked at his aunt for a moment, and his voice did not change, and his face did not change, and yet something behind his eyes was very old and very tired. The expression of a man setting down at last. Something he has been carrying for 14 years. "I know why you did it," he said. "I know what you believed you were protecting. I am not here to punish you. I am here to correct it." The Duchess looked at Eliza. Something in her face, for one unguarded moment, was quite exposed. Not cruelty, not malice, but the naked shock of a woman whose logic has held for 14 years and is now, in this room, in front of these witnesses, very publicly not holding. She looked at Eliza the way one finally looks at a fact one has been successfully ignoring for a long time. Lady Sophronia turned her head toward the window. The 3 other women in the room went very still. Edmund crossed the drawing room in 3 deliberate strides and came to stand at Eliza's side. He turned to face the room. "Do stay, if you would. I believe you have been waiting for this particular moment for quite some time." A silence so complete that the fire in the grate was audible, the snap of a log settling, the faint ring of it in the tall room. "She is Miss Eliza Harwood," Edmund said, "and she is my choice." He said it the way he said everything. Quietly, without volume, without theater. He said it the way he had said, "Do not sell it, and I will, and it was mine to correct." He said it as if it were a statement of navigational fact, a position plotted on a chart, something from which he did not intend to deviate. The Duchess's hand, which had been raised slightly, lowered. Her fan, held at the careful height Eliza had noticed on the afternoon she first came into the shop, did not move. It simply went still, the way a pendulum goes still when the mechanism has stopped. Lady Sophronia looked at the window. Then she looked away from the window. She looked at her hands, folded in her lap. The solicitor, who had been waiting in the anteroom and was now shown in by the footman, entered with a folio of documents and confirmed, in the dry, steady voice of a man who has done this before and finds it entirely proper, that the record was filed, the claim was supported, and that the proceedings for restoration of the Harwood entitlement were formally commenced as of 3 days prior. The Duchess said nothing for a long moment. She looked at the documents in Calloway's hands, and then she sat down, not dramatically, but carefully, the way a woman sits when something she has managed for a very long time has been taken out of her hands by a procedure she cannot contest. She looked at Edmund. She said, "You are very like your father." He said, "I know." He did not say it as a compliment, and he did not say it as a wound. He said it as a piece of the truth that belonged to both of them equally. He turned to Eliza then, in the quiet room, in front of the witnesses, and he offered her his arm. And she took it, because there was nothing else to do with an offered hand but take it, and because she was her mother's daughter and her father's daughter, and she had been waiting, she understood now, in one form or another, for a very long time. By the first week of February, the legal proceedings were well advanced, and the solicitors were confident. The question of the Harwood entitlement was no longer a question, but a matter of procedural timing. Months, rather than years. The machinery of the law moving as it moves when the evidence is sound and the claim is clear. Eliza was still living above the shop, because she and Mr. Tidewell had agreed that February was an awkward moment to arrange otherwise, and she had never been a woman who arranged otherwise simply because it was offered. She would wait until the arrangements were settled. She had spent most of her life being precise about what was settled and what was merely hoped for, and old habits of precision are not abandoned easily. She was at Ashley House on a Wednesday evening, not for the first time, in the small library on the west side of the building, where Edmund kept the things that mattered to him. The room was not large and was not arranged for display. It had the particular quality of a room that is used rather than shown. Books consulted and returned to slightly different angles, a desk with papers that were apparently in an order known only to their owner, a worn armchair near the fire with a footstool that had been precisely positioned by long habit. The fire was lit. The chest was there, on a low shelf beside a row of volumes in brown and green leather, cleaned and emptied of its legal contents, sitting in the firelight as quietly as a finished thing. She had looked at it when she came in, as she always did when she was in this room. And then she had looked away, because the chest itself no longer held anything she needed. What it had held was elsewhere now, in Calloway's files, and the official register, and the proceedings that were grinding forward with their slow, reliable certainty. She was holding the miniature portrait. She had found it at the bottom of the chest on the night Calloway opened it, beneath the marriage register and a folded piece of correspondence, tucked into a corner as if someone had placed it there for safekeeping and not had occasion to retrieve it. It was small, the size of her palm, painted on ivory in the manner of the previous century, a portrait of a woman of perhaps 30, with dark hair dressed simply and a calm expression, and eyes that were, somewhat improbably, Eliza's own eyes. Not similar. The same particular directness in them, the same quality of looking at the painter without either performance or evasion. On the back, in a handwriting she recognized as her father's handwriting from his letters, 3 words had been written, small and careful, in ink gone brown with age. Your grandmother, Anne. She had not known what her grandmother looked like. She had not known the portrait existed. She had held it in the solicitor's office for a long time that evening, longer than was entirely dignified, and Edmund had not said anything, which was correct of him, and Calloway had found something to attend to in the other room. She sat with it now in her hand, and the fire warm against her face, and the chest on the shelf, and the familiar sound of Edmund's step in the passage outside the library door. He came in. He poured 2 glasses from the decanter on the table and set one beside her and sat in the chair across the fire with his coat still on, because he had been out and had not been back long. He looked at the portrait in her hand. "How long had it been in there?" he said. "I do not know," she said. "Since the beginning, perhaps. Since the chest was sealed." She turned the portrait over and looked at her grandmother's face, the direct and steady eyes. "She looks practical," she said. "She does," he said. He was watching her with the expression she had come to know, the one that was not quite approval, and was something considerably larger than approval. Something patient and certain, The expression of a man who has arrived, after a long and indirect route, at a place he intends to remain. She said, "Edmund." He said, "Eliza." He said her name the way a man says something he has been very careful with for a long time, carrying it in a coat pocket the way one carries a worn brass key, against the warmth. She had heard her name said by a great many people in 23 years. She had not heard it said quite like that before, with that particular quality of intention and arrival. She looked at him across the fire. She looked at the chest on the shelf, empty and at rest, and the portrait in her hand, and the brass key on the table beside the decanter, where he had put it on the day Calloway's work was done, setting it down with a steadiness that was different from his usual steadiness. The steadiness of a man releasing something he has carried long enough. The Harwood claim was in motion. The chest was empty. The key had found at last the lock it belonged to. She set the miniature portrait down on the table beside the decanter, beside the key, very carefully, the way one sets down something that one intends to pick up again for a very long time. Her grandmother looked up from the table with her calm and practical eyes. Outside the library window, snow had begun to fall. It came down soft and white and steady against the dark, unhurried, covering the street and the iron railing and the stone steps below with the quiet patience of a thing that has all winter to do what it is doing. In the firelight, the room was warm, and the chest sat on the shelf with its long work done. And Edmund said her name again, just once, and it sounded like the particular moment a key turns in a lock that has been waiting for it. She was her grandmother's granddaughter. She was her father's daughter. She was her mother's child. And her mother had stood at a door 14 years ago and asked for what was hers and been turned away. She had not been forgotten. She had only been waiting, as things sometimes must, for the right set of circumstances to return what had been taken. She looked at Edmund across the fire, and she allowed herself to believe what the room was saying, which was that the waiting was over, and that what came next was not deliverance, but simply the ordinary life of a woman in a room she could call her own, with a man who had corrected what was his to correct, and a portrait of her grandmother on the table beside a small brass key and snow falling outside a window. She had now, at last, the right to claim. If her story has stayed with you, I am glad of it. She stayed with me.